Let me ask a question of Andy. Andy, let's assume that if you're correct that OPEC constrains production and thus produces higher oil prices than otherwise would be the case, and if you're correct that oil prices are more volatile because of OPEC than otherwise would be the case, I'm wondering what it is that prevents markets from efficiently adjusting. For instance, if there's less crude oil in the market because of OPEC, well, that's just a greater incentive to conserve. So is there a market failure as far as market response and conservation? And if there's greater volatility, I would assume that market actors would have a greater incentive to hedge against price volatility, which you can do in futures markets if you're a major actor. And if you're just a consumer, well, one way to hedge against price volatility is just buy energy efficient stuff because you know prices are going to go all over the place. Would you agree that markets are capable of adjusting to the problems that OPEC puts at our economic doorstep, or that it isn't?
Certainly markets can adjust to almost anything, right? So markets appear everywhere and markets can adjust.
I'll qualify, adjust efficiently.
Adjust efficiently, I mean, again, yes, we can react to, if you jack the price of oil up, people will react, they'll change their behavior. It may take them a while. I don't buy a car every year, so it's going to take me a while to buy a more fuel-efficient car. I don't think that's the issue, whether we can adjust to a problem. The question is whether or not the sort of after the adjustment, we're better off or worse off compared to where we would be if we didn't have to make that adjustment.
So what can we do about the existence of a cartel? It seems to us that Saudi Arabia doesn't ask our permission, neither do the rest of the OPEC.
It's interesting, actually. One of the things that I learned that I hadn't known when reading some of the history of OPEC is how much, particularly the Nixon and Ford administrations, thought OPEC was a terrific idea. And the reason they did was they wanted to transfer resources to friendly governments there, and they didn't think the American people would put up with writing a check to the Saudis. So that an indirect way of writing a check to the Saudis was to promote higher oil prices and thus transfer resources, particularly to the Saudis and Iran. So
you may even remember that in the Reagan administration, President Reagan sent Vice President Bush out to Riyadh in 1985 to head off the price collapse everybody saw coming, simply to keep the Saudi government well-funded and thus an active ally against Soviet power in the Middle East.
Yeah. So I think in terms of U.S. policy, we've often, in pursuit of things that most people in this room, since they're at a Cato event, probably wouldn't like, the U.S. government has actually promoted OPEC over the years.
Well, that's a good segue to Jim. I wanted to ask Jim a question about the Texas Railroad Commission. I've run into a number of different academic and policy papers from the gray literature, from the peer-reviewed literature, that make the case that cartels are our friend, are the consumer's friend, not just the producer's friend, but the consumer's friend. The argument goes that the natural state of things in oil markets is price volatility for the reasons you mentioned, because of inelastic supply and demand curves and all of that. And that a well-functioning cartel would be, on balance, were it well-functioning and not clumsy, capable of reducing price volatility and giving more predictability to the market and that sort of thing, since that's in producers' interest as well. Do you think that the Texas Railroad Commission played that role of the well-functioning cartel that gave us some price stability during its period of suzerainty before it was displaced by OPEC? And then secondly, do you think that any cartel can really do that, since that seems to be something I run across every now and then in the literature?
Well, it's a great question, and there's an important difference between the Texas Railroad Commission and OPEC. I think that the Texas Railroad Commission did a very good job of stabilizing oil prices. They went about it very formally by having monthly surveys of expected demand. They also had the power legally to shut in production. They were the conservation regulator in the state of Texas, and this program spread through all of the state conservation commissions. So it would be a legally enforceable cartel. OPEC members are individual sovereigns. We know that OPEC is described as a sovereign. It's really a collection of individual sovereigns, none of which have the authority to enforce their will on the others. Every cartel in that situation faces the problem of what's called prisoner's dilemma. It's great if everybody sticks with the plan, but nobody has an individual incentive to do that. They want the others to cut back while they can enjoy the gains. This is what the Texas Railroad Commission solved. It provided a mechanism to enforce discipline, and frankly, OPEC has sought in vain for a similar type of enforcement. You mentioned 1985, 86, when the Saudis finally brought the hammer down and said, okay, we're going to force this by bringing prices down under $10. That got their attention for a while, but then cheating on the quotas, again, always breaks through. And I would point out that a cartel that cheats is essentially not a cartel. It's a competitive market. If all the members produce to where their marginal benefit is maximized, well, that's what competitive producers do as well. So in some sense, we have seen a mixture of a competitive versus market power structure within OPEC, and it does vary year to year, depending upon other circumstances, both political as well as economic.
One of your papers that quite interested, one of the arguments you made in a paper which quite interested me was that we see very little evidence, according to your work, that the cartel puts its foot on the gas or on the brake to try to adjust oil prices by increasing or decreasing production, as most people think. But the reality is, in other words, you don't see much variability in OPEC production. You never have. But what you do see is a lack of investment in upstream capacity. OPEC can produce today about as much as it could produce in 1973 or 1975 or something like that. And so your paper argued that the real impact of the cartel isn't goosing the market or strangling the market and trying to manipulate prices. The real impact of the OPEC cartel is that it, for whatever reason, isn't investing in upstream capacity like you otherwise might have expected. One thing I thought when I read that is that, well, the cartel may be the reason why they're not investing in upstream capacity. Perhaps there's some sort of secret agreement that, like the alcoholic who can't promise not to drink again, they can promise not to restock the liquor cabinet, and that's what they're going to do. But if that's the case, isn't there a possible alternative explanation that, well, these are regimes which have short-term time horizons because they're largely authoritarian. They are in unstable parts of the world. They've got tens of billions of dollars, which they can either invest in upstream capacity that may or may not pay back to them some years down the road because that regime may not be in place, or they can pay it off to political opponents, secret police, military, grand palaces and whatnot, and get immediate consumption. I'm wondering what you make of that. Of that cause for the lack of upstream capacity. Is it really the cartel, or is that settled yet?
Oh, it's probably not settled yet, but I do firmly believe that their main impact on the market has been the fact that they have never allowed much excess capacity to build up. It only builds up when there's a global economic slowdown, so it builds up not purposefully on OPEC's behalf, but it builds up because they didn't see the slowdown coming, and then prices erode because that excess capacity gets used. I think OPEC is quite afraid of excess capacity, especially in the hands of anyone but Saudi Arabia, and therefore better that it not be built, and it's expensive. People talk about the cheap cost of oil coming out of the Persian Gulf now. You know, the incremental investments there in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, these are getting to be quite expensive fields compared to where we were 20 years ago. And they're not going to idly make investments and then keep all of that shut in, risking that it is going to be used. We don't know their objective function, all of the other considerations that drive their decisions, how they're going to spend their investable funds, but none of them are short on funds. They haven't been short on funds during this 20-year period when essentially investment in reserves was static. They had plenty of money to do that if they wanted. It wasn't this or something else.
One last question. I'm going to go back to Fred for a second. Fred, it struck me that when you went through what you had hoped to accomplish with your policy agenda, that there seemed to be much more direct policy means by which you could achieve those objectives if that's our objective. So, for instance, if we want to reduce our dependency on foreign crude or crude that doesn't come from North America, it would strike me that the simplest way of doing that would just pop an oil tariff on and not get into the rest of this stuff. You put a tariff on crude oil imports outside of North America and then let the market adjust. Or if our interest is in reducing petroleum consumption, then simpler than having a CAFE standard would be just to have an energy tax, right, or a gasoline or oil tax. And in fact, there's a mountain of economic analyses done that show that the cost of a fuels tax is only a small percentage of the true cost of the CAFE standard, so the better way of going about it is just a tax. Or if we want to diversify away from oil and transportation markets, I assume high oil prices give us incentives to do that. But if there's not enough incentive to do that because of market failures in research and development, which I know there are arguments for, why not just have a robust R&D tax credit, that refundable R&D tax credit? These were all things that seemed to me to be more direct ways of getting at your policy objectives, and yet SAFE doesn't seem to be entertaining them, and I'm wondering why.
In regard to the potential of a tariff on imported petroleum and exempting domestically produced oil, that would be contrary to most of the trade agreements and that we have signed in our obligations under the WTO. So that's a non-starter. In the case of the oil tax, you're exactly right, and in fact, the ESLC and SAFE has said quite publicly, you know, a better solution than CAFE would be to just put a tax on petroleum, which would provide the economic incentive to develop alternatives in a market-based way. But the reality is, it is a complete political, it's not going to happen in this country. I mean, the President of the United States has said that it took him a while to realize it, but his popularity goes up and down, not for any other reason than the price of gasoline. Yesterday, I was testifying at the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on the requirement to increase, the industry supports it. We have 660 airplanes, but 90-some-odd thousand trucks. And the entire industry supports increasing fuel taxes because our infrastructure has not kept pace. It hadn't been increased since 1994. The reason that they haven't been able to increase the fuel tax is because during the same period of time, you've seen the price of petroleum go up from 2001. I think we were paying about 67 cents for a gallon of jet fuel. It's now about $3.30. It's a 5X. So as the price of fuel has gone up, it's taken about $2,500 to $3,000 out of the average family's disposable income. It's gone from about 3% to almost 5% of their GDP. So the reason that we advocated CAFE standards was precisely because we did not think we could get fuel taxes put in place. And the last one was?
The refundable R&D tax credit.
Well, clearly, R&D is a very important part of this equation because we all benefit from the breakthroughs that have been made by inventors and scientists and so forth. But if you look at the history of R&D, the most of the R, most of it, not all of it, has been funded by the government. And what we call R&D in the private sector is really production development. Mm-hmm. And so National Institute of Health, DARPA, ARPA-E, it seems to us that that's where, in the scheme of things, a relatively small amount of money can be sent to try to move these to move these technologies along or provide incentives for the market to try to cross the chasm. I mean, we would not support and did not support direct investment by the government in things like battery manufacturers or so forth. You need to be doing it on the pure R&D side of the house where no private entity can take the heat of spending that kind of money or trying to put some sort of incentives to drag the technology into the marketplace, which has been done, you know, many times before on a number of different technologies.